Gary Cooper was a billion-dollar monument to straight, aggressive masculinity. He was also the most expensive lie in Hollywood history. Off-screen, the ultimate American cowboy went home to another man, Anderson Lawler. When Paramount Pictures discovered their alpha male in a secret gay cohabitation, they orchestrated the most ruthless cover-up of the Golden Age, blackmail, a forced fake marriage. Anderson Lawler permanently erased from existence. They did not just hide a romance to protect the box office. They engineered a lifelong suffocating heterosexual illusion, burying the real Gary Cooper alive. On the Paramount Pictures lot, Gary Cooper and Anderson Lawler existed in two entirely different worlds. Cooper was the golden goose, the multi-million-dollar pillar of aggressively straight masculinity that kept the studio solvent. Lawler was just a minor contract player, expendable, easily replaced, and largely ignored. Yet behind the heavily guarded gates of late 1920s Hollywood, a dangerous secret bound them together. Far from the glaring studio lights, the highest-paid symbol of American heterosexual dominance and a background character actor were quietly sharing a home, a life, and a forbidden romance. It was an unsanctioned bond that didn't just break the rules, it threatened to shatter Paramount's entire empire. During the late 1920s and the dawn of the 1930s, the highest-paid symbol of American heterosexual dominance and a background character actor maintained a secret, subterranean gay cohabitation. This same-sex relationship created a severe, terrifying anomaly in the otherwise total surveillance state of the Hollywood studio system. The sheer gravity of this secret domestic life shattered the carefully engineered illusion of his corporate mandate. On the sound stages of Paramount, the environment was strictly engineered to project solitary, masculine violence and heterosexual conquest. Cooper was costumed in frontier gear, positioned under harsh lighting, AE, and directed to exude a predatory dominance over his female co-stars. He was the physical embodiment of the traditional patriarch. He was the alpha male executing his corporate duty, a living billboard for the mandated heterosexual ideal. But the moment the director called cut, the corporate illusion was abruptly discarded. Historical accounts and industry records from the era document a frantic urgency in Cooper's departure from the studio lot. He would shed the heavy manufactured persona of the aggressive straight cowboy and retreat rapidly into the secluded, highly guarded residence he shared with Anderson Lawler. Within the architectural confines of this specific Hollywood property, the heterosexual facade completely evaporated. Those who operated within the discreet, deeply closeted underground circles of late 1920s Los Angeles noted that in his private interactions with Lawler, Cooper was refined, domesticated, and vulnerable, traits that Paramount spent exorbitant sums of money actively suppressing from the public record. Their shared residence functioned as a vital yet highly vulnerable queer sanctuary. It was a psychological decompression chamber where the crushing demands of performing compulsive heterosexuality could be temporarily suspended. In a city where homosexuality was not only a career-ending scandal, but a felony punishable by imprisonment under California sodomy laws, their home occasionally served as a secure meeting ground for Hollywood's elite, closeted gay and bisexual artistic community. It was a physical space where Cooper could exist authentically alongside another man, entirely divorced from his status as a heterosexual intellectual property. However, in the highly weaponized corporate ecosystem of the studio conglomerates, this homosexual domesticity was an illusion of safety. For Gary Cooper and Anderson Lawler, queer privacy was not a human right. It was a direct, actionable breach of contract. This same-sex living arrangement triggered sheer, unadulterated panic within the executive suites of Paramount Pictures, especially given the precarious socio-economic landscape of the late 1920s. The Hollywood film industry was navigating a terrifying industrial transition. The advent of synchronized sound was destroying established careers overnight, while the economic instability preceding the Wall Street crash of 1929 meant that the major studios were operating under extreme fiscal pressure. They answered to aggressive boards of directors and conservative East Coast financiers. They required guaranteed, risk-free returns on their investments, and those returns were entirely dependent on the mainstream, puritanical American public's acceptance of the stars they manufactured. Paramount Pictures had identified that the traumatized post-World War I global audience demonstrated a distinct consumer preference for men who projected unshakable stability and traditional, uncompromising heterosexuality. They had invested unprecedented capital into Gary Cooper to fill this exact market demand. Every press release, every curated photograph, every manufactured rumor of a liaison with a leading lady was meticulously engineered to reinforce this specific brand of straight hypermasculinity. When Paramount executives discovered this secret cohabitation, they didn't see a private romance. They saw a multi-million-dollar liability. For a studio banking its entire fortune on Cooper's rugged ladies' man persona, a male lover was an existential threat. Their weapon of choice was the morality clause. Buried in every studio contract, it wasn't about ethics. It was a ruthless legal leash. It gave Paramount total ownership over an actor's private life, with the power to freeze assets, destroy careers, and erase anyone who stepped out of line. The clause explicitly stipulated that the studio held the unilateral power to terminate a contract, withhold all future earnings, and effectively permanently blacklist an actor if the A engaged in any conduct that brought ridicule, scandal, or public disdain upon the company, or if they deviated from the strict heterosexual standards of the conservative American demographic. In the socio-political context of the late 1920s, a male actor's commercial viability was exclusively tied to his perceived heterosexuality. Homosexuality was criminalized by the state, pathologized by the medical establishment, and viewed by the general public as an ultimate moral decay. The era's brief tolerance for the theatrical pansy craze in underground cabarets did not extend to the leading men of motion pictures. For Paramount Pictures, verifying that their primary commercial asset, the man they were globally distributing as the undisputed pinnacle of female desire, was returning home every night to a male lover, was a scenario that threatened to bankrupt the corporation. The executives were acutely aware that the press of the era, while generally dependent on studio access, was ultimately driven by profit and sensationalism. If a rival studio, an extortionist, or a hostile syndicated gossip columnist acquired verifiable photographic or testimonial proof of Cooper and Lawler's same-sex partnership, the resulting PR cataclysm would not merely damage Gary Cooper's personal reputation, it would instantly and irrevocably invalidate his entire filmography. The global audience, having purchased tickets based on the promise of his heterosexual virility, would feel fundamentally deceived and reject him entirely. The box office returns for his current and upcoming slates of films would collapse within days. This exposure would cause a cascading financial failure wiping out millions of dollars in projected revenue, alienating conservative investors, and threatening the very liquidity of Paramount Pictures itself. The studio board of directors did not view Anderson Lawler as a human being who provided domestic stability and genuine affection to their overworked, highly acid star. They viewed Lawler as a hostile foreign contaminant that had breached their highly controlled manufacturing process. The shared house was not a home. It was a glaring, unacceptable, and highly illegal vulnerability. Paramount's response involved no negotiation. Fueled by immense capital and ironclad contracts, the studio mobilized to dismantle this private sanctuary. For the executives, Cooper's manufactured masculinity was an investment too massive to fail. If protecting their ultimate star meant destroying the man underneath and erasing his partner, they were ready to pull the trigger. The era of the clandestine safe house was abruptly coming to a violent end. The eradication of Gary Cooper and Anderson Lawler's homosexual domesticity was not executed through sudden, explosive public confrontation, nor did it involve the messy, unpredictable theater of a courtroom battle. The Hollywood studio system of the late 1920s and early 1930s operated as a sovereign corporate state, and its violence was distinctively bloodless, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly efficient. When the executive board at Paramount Pictures officially classified the same-sex cohabitation of their most valuable heterosexual asset as a critical liability, they did not act with emotional outrage. They acted with the cold, calculated precision of risk management. The objective was absolute: dismantle the queer relationship, neutralize the secondary party, and sanitize the primary asset without leaving a single trace of corporate intervention for the press to uncover. To execute this bloodless purge, the studio mobilized its internal crisis management infrastructure. During the Golden Age, every major film conglomerate maintained a shadow department of fixers, attorneys, former law enforcement officers, and ruthless public relations executives whose sole occupational mandate was to suppress scandal and enforce the morality clauses of their contracted employees. These operatives operated outside the purview of traditional law, utilizing extortion, bribery, and the threat of total professional annihilation to protect the studio's financial investments. When the dossier containing the verifiable reality of Cooper and Lawler's same-sex partnership was placed on the desks of the Paramount hierarchy, the fixers were authorized to utilize their full arsenal. The immediate tactical priority was the physical separation of the two men. The shared residence, which had functioned as a clandestine queer sanctuary, was abruptly reclassified by the studio as a contaminated zone. The eviction of Gary Cooper from the premises was not a negotiation. It was a mandatory corporate directive. The fixers descended upon the property, representing the omnipotent will of the Paramount board. They presented Cooper with a stark, non-negotiable ultimatum: vacate the premises and sever all contact with his male partner immediately, or face the immediate activation of the morality clause. The activation of this clause would trigger the immediate suspension of his contract, the freezing of his assets, and the deliberate leaking of highly damaging, carefully constructed rumors to allied gossip columnists that would permanently destroy his standing with the conservative American public. The psychological brutality of this physical extraction cannot be overstated. Cooper, the cinematic embodiment of rugged individualism and unyielding authority, was reduced to the status of a reprimanded subordinate. He was ordered to pack his belongings and abandon the only environment where he was permitted to exist authentically. The sanctuary was violated, the locks were changed, and the architectural footprint of their homosexual relationship was systematically dismantled. Simultaneously, the corporate apparatus turned its crosshairs onto Anderson Lawler. In the ruthless hierarchy of the studio system, Lawler was highly vulnerable. He did not generate millions of dollars in international revenue. He was a dispensable character actor. Therefore, the strategy employed against him was not one of rehabilitation, but of immediate, overwhelming suppression. The fixers isolated Lawler and delivered a coordinated psychological assault. They leveraged the ultimate weapon in the Hollywood arsenal, the blacklist. Lawler was explicitly informed that any attempt to resist the separation, any effort to contact Gary Cooper, or any indiscretion regarding their shared sexual history would result in his total professional erasure. The studio possessed the infrastructural power to ensure that his name was circulated among the casting directors and executives of every major and minor production company in California, permanently flagging him as an unemployable subversive. In an era where homosexuality was a criminal offense and societal homophobia was absolute, Lawler possessed zero legal recourse. He could not sue for wrongful termination, nor could he appeal to the press without inciting a scandal that would result in his own arrest and public ruin. The tragedy of Anderson Lawler during this purge is the tragedy of absolute voicelessness. He was forced into the role of the silent collateral damage. He had to stand paralyzed and watch as the corporate machinery confiscated the man he lived with, legally mandating the end of their relationship to protect a manufactured heterosexual brand. Lawler's compliance was secured through terror. He was permitted to remain on the periphery of the industry, securing minor roles, solely on the condition of his continued absolute silence. He became a ghost in his own life, a man forced to swallow his own erasure to survive in an ecosystem that criminalized his existence. With the physical separation achieved and Lawler effectively neutralized through the threat of the blacklist, Paramount Pictures recognized that the psychological reprogramming of Gary Cooper required a more drastic intervention. The executives observed that despite his physical removal from the shared residence, Cooper remained psychologically tethered to the relationship. He exhibited signs of severe emotional distress, exhaustion, and a dangerous apathy toward his carefully curated public persona. The studio realized that a mere change of address in Los Angeles was insufficient. The proximity to Lawler and the constant reminder of his subjugated state posed a lingering threat to his performance as the ultimate alpha male. Therefore, the corporate board authorized the next phase of the campaign, the forced exile. In 1930, Paramount Pictures orchestrated a sudden, highly publicized European vacation for Gary Cooper. To the global public and the entertainment press, the narrative was masterfully spun. The studio's public relations department issued press releases claiming that their biggest star was suffering from nervous exhaustion due to his relentless filming schedule. They painted the picture of an overworked, dedicated artist who required a restorative journey across the Atlantic to recuperate his strength. But beneath the veneer of a restorative holiday lay a ruthless corporate strategy. The European trip was a forced exile. It was a calculated move of geographical isolation designed to break Cooper's resistance. By shipping him across the Atlantic, guarded by a retinue of studio fixers and corporate chaperones, Paramount physically severed his access to Lawler and effectively locked him in a luxurious, heavily monitored cage. Furthermore, he did not travel as a free man. The studio ensured that he was constantly accompanied by a retinue of handlers, fixers, and corporate chaperones. His itinerary was rigidly managed. His interactions were heavily monitored, and his environment was completely controlled by the corporation that owned him. During this period of transatlantic exile, the true weight of his corporate enslavement descended upon Cooper. The psychological warfare utilized by the studio was designed to induce total compliance. His handlers systematically reinforced the reality of his situation. His wealth, his global fame, and his entire identity were conditional. They belonged to Paramount Pictures, and they could be revoked at a moment's notice if he failed to adhere to the heterosexual mandate. He was subjected to a relentless conditioning process that equated his homosexual desires with professional suicide and public disgrace. The dissonance between his public image and his private reality reached a breaking point during this exile. He was internationally celebrated as the patron saint of American masculinity, a man who bowed to no authority and dictated his own destiny. Yet sitting in luxurious European hotel rooms, surrounded by corporate guards, he was entirely impotent. He could not protect the man he loved. He could not defend his own private life. He was a multi-million-dollar asset, stripped of the basic agency afforded to the lowest citizen. The cognitive dissonance of being simultaneously the most idolized man in the world and a captive corporate asset resulted in a profound psychological collapse. The studio's objective during this exile was not merely to wait out the scandal. It was to ensure that the Gary Cooper who returned to American soil was fundamentally altered. They required an asset who had accepted the futility of resistance. The psychological breakdown experienced during this period was the intended outcome of the corporate strategy. The executives understood that before they could rebuild him into the permanent, unshakable pillar of heterosexual virtue, they first had to completely demolish the man who had dared to seek domestic solace with Anderson Lawler. The bloodless purge was successful. The relationship was dismantled, the secondary party was silenced, and the primary asset was isolated in a transatlantic cage, being slowly ground down until he was ready to accept the final permanent terms of his surrender. When Gary Cooper was finally authorized to return to American soil following his mandated European exile, the asset that disembarked in New York was fundamentally altered. The psychological reprogramming initiated by Paramount Pictures had achieved its primary objective. The studio executives did not welcome back a defiant artist or a man seeking to reclaim his severed homosexual domesticity. They received a compliant, neutralized corporate entity. The transatlantic isolation, combined with the relentless, systematic threats to his livelihood and the enforced separation from Anderson Lawler, had successfully broken his internal resistance. However, the corporate board understood that temporary compliance was insufficient for long-term fiscal stability. The era of the Bachelor cover story was rapidly closing. The impending enforcement of the Motion Picture Production Code, the notoriously strict moral censorship guidelines, known as the Hays Code, meant that the federal and cultural scrutiny on Hollywood was intensifying. Any residual rumors regarding Cooper's homosexual cohabitation with Lawler remained a volatile liability. To secure their multi-million-dollar investment permanently, Paramount Pictures required a structural, legally binding solution. They required a permanent heterosexual shield. This corporate requirement birthed the execution of a highly sophisticated, deeply cynical industry mechanism, the Lavender marriage. In the sanitized histories of Hollywood, these unions are frequently portrayed as pragmatic alliances or mutual friendships. In the ruthless reality of the 1930s studio system, a Lavender marriage was a contractual merger designed specifically to launder a homosexual identity. It was a strategic, high-stakes public relations acquisition orchestrated by studio fixers to manufacture an impenetrable facade of heterosexuality for their most valuable assets. For Gary Cooper, the ultimate symbol of American male virility, the studio could not afford a flawed or transparent arrangement. The execution of this contract required the selection of a very specific demographic profile to serve as the corporate wife. Paramount did not select a struggling starlet or a minor contract player for this role. Such a choice would have generated internal Hollywood gossip and invited press scrutiny regarding the transactional nature of the union. Instead, the studio strategists looked outside the entertainment ecosystem, targeting a demographic that projected unassailable moral and social superiority, the East Coast aristocracy. The chosen candidate was Veronica Balfe, widely known in high society as Rocky. Balfe was not a Hollywood insider. She was the stepdaughter of a prominent Wall Street governor, an elite New York socialite, a devout Catholic, and a woman possessing a flawless patrician resume. The strategic brilliance of selecting Veronica Balfe lay in her absolute detachment from the sordid realities of the film industry. By attaching the rugged frontier image of Gary Cooper to the aristocratic, highly respectable lineage of the Balfe family, Paramount Pictures achieved a dual PR victory. First, they elevated Cooper's cultural status from a mere actor to a member of the American elite, expanding his demographic appeal to more conservative, affluent audiences. Second, and most critically, they completely neutralized the homosexual threat. In the socio-cultural logic of the 1930s, it was inconceivable to the American public that a man married to a fiercely respectable high society Catholic heiress could possess a hidden homosexual life. Balfe was the ultimate sanitizing agent. Her presence beside Cooper in photographs effectively immunized him against any lingering whispers regarding Anderson Lawler. The courtship and subsequent wedding, finalized in December 1933, were not matters of private romance. They were highly choreographed corporate press events. Every photograph, every public appearance, and every leaked anecdote to the syndicated column. Innes was meticulously curated by Paramount's publicity department to project a narrative of traditional, aggressive, heterosexual conquest. When Cooper walked down the aisle, the flashing bulbs of the press cameras captured what the shareholders demanded: the definitive proof of concept. The alpha male had been successfully domesticated within the rigid parameters of societal expectations. The 1933 marriage to Veronica Balfe effectively neutralized any lingering rumors. By binding their star to a prominent aristocratic Catholic family, Paramount achieved a permanent public relations shield. The discreet, unmonitored life Cooper once maintained was entirely replaced by a highly visible domestic reality that aligned perfectly with conservative American values. The psychological toll of this forced heterosexual confinement on a man who had previously maintained a deeply committed homosexual partnership was catastrophic. The studio had successfully preserved the physical asset of Gary Cooper, but they had fundamentally fractured his psyche. This fracture manifested in a highly specific, deeply destructive behavioral pattern that defined the remainder of his life and career. Following his forced marriage, Cooper threw himself into a reckless string of highly publicized affairs with iconic co-stars like Ingrid Bergman, Grace Kelly, and Patricia Neal. Hollywood lore romanticizes this as the ultimate proof of his irresistible playboy charm. But beneath the glamorous headlines, a much darker reality was playing out. This wasn't just unbridled lust. It was a desperate, chaotic performance. Stripped of his authentic life with Lawler, Cooper's relentless pursuit of women became a way to violently overcompensate. It was a frantic smokescreen, a continuous effort to prove to the studio, the public, and perhaps himself that he was exactly the straight, dominant alpha male they demanded him to be. The more trapped he felt, the more aggressively he played the part. Having been stripped of his authentic sexual identity and traumatized by the corporate eradication of his relationship with Anderson Lawler, Cooper internalized the homophobia of the industry that owned him. His hypersexuality was a defense mechanism, a frantic, continuous effort to prove to the studio, to the public, and perhaps most tragically to himself, that he was the aggressively straight man he was contracted to be. Every highly publicized affair served as a shield, generating a smokescreen of heterosexual scandal that completely obscured his homosexual past. It was a methodology of self-destruction masked as virility. He was executing the studio's directive of the alpha male to a toxic, pathological extreme. By engaging in these relentless conquests, he ensured that the fixers and the press remained entirely focused on his heterosexual transgressions, thereby guaranteeing that no one would ever look deep enough to uncover the buried reality of his life with Lawler. The paradox of his masculinity was absolute. The more he was forced to suppress his true homosexual identity, the more aggressively and destructively he had to perform a fabricated heterosexual dominance. The marriage to Balfe, rather than stabilizing him, had weaponized his sexuality against himself. He became a prisoner of his own manufactured image, forced to constantly feed the illusion to prevent his own professional and social annihilation. While Gary Cooper was navigating this loud, chaotic, and highly destructive trajectory in the blinding glare of the international spotlight, a parallel silent tragedy was unfolding in the subterranean margins of Hollywood. Anderson Lawler, the man who had shared Cooper's home and his authentic self, was systematically relegated to the shadows. The corporate machinery that had elevated Cooper and forced him into the Lavender marriage had simultaneously executed a campaign of total erasure against Lawler. The threat of the blacklist, delivered by Paramount's fixers, during the initial purge, remained a permanent invisible gun pointed at Lawler's head. He was permitted to exist within the geographical boundaries of Los Angeles and to secure marginal, uncredited roles in the industry, but only under the strict condition of his absolute enduring silence. He was legally, professionally, and socially neutralized. The psychological torture inflicted upon Anderson Lawler by this systemic homophobia is difficult to quantify. He was forced to become an invisible spectator to his own life's tragedy. He had to live in a city plastered with billboards projecting the hyper-masculine image of the man he loved. He had to read the syndicated gossip columns detailing Cooper's playboy exploits and his pristine high society marriage. He had to witness the absolute erasure of their shared history, watching as the studio effectively deleted his existence from Cooper's biography to protect the corporate bottom line. Lawler represents the ultimate collateral damage of the Golden Age's heteronormative mandate. While Cooper's suffering was manifested in hypervisible destructive performances of masculinity, Lawler's suffering was defined by enforced invisibility. He was a gay man, trapped in an era and an industry that deemed his very existence to be a prosecutable offense, and a corporate liability. He could not claim his history, he could not defend his relationship, and he could not seek societal validation without inviting immediate professional destruction and potential criminal prosecution under California law. The juxtaposition of these two fates highlights the absolute ruthless efficiency of the studio system's violence. Paramount Pictures successfully utilized their immense capital and their legal infrastructure to bisect a human relationship, sending one man into a highly publicized, self-destructive heterosexual prison, and the other into a permanent, silent exile. The Lavender marriage was not merely a cover story, it was a life sentence, viva fe, or Gary Cooper, and a decree of erasure for Anderson Lawler. Both men, regardless of their position on the Hollywood call sheet, were ultimately reduced to corporate puppets. Their lives, their identities, and their sexualities completely subordinated to the financial imperatives of an industry that prioritized the illusion of the alpha male over the reality of human dignity. When Gary Cooper married Veronica Balfe in 1933, Paramount Pictures had not just solved a public relations crisis. They had constructed a permanent, inescapable fortress around their star, inaugurating a suffocating decades-long phase of corporate maintenance to keep the illusion alive. The studio executives understood that acquiring a high society aristocratic shield was only the initial logistical step in neutralizing the homosexual liability posed by Cooper's history with Anderson Lawler. To permanently secure their multi-million-dollar asset, the studio apparatus had to transition from crisis management to daily operational surveillance. The marriage required relentless industrial upkeep to ensure the facade of the alpha male remained completely impenetrable to both the press and the public. During the 1930s and into the 1940s, the Hollywood studio system perfected the mechanics of manufacturing and sustaining the family man narrative. For Gary Cooper, this meant his private life was entirely subordinated to the promotional schedules dictated by the corporate publicity departments. The domestic sphere he shared with Balfe was systematically converted into a secondary soundstage. Synergistic relationships with powerful fan magazines, such as Photoplay and Modern Screen, were leveraged to distribute a steady, highly controlled stream of sanitized domestic imagery. Photographers were routinely granted exclusive, heavily curated access to the Cooper residence, capturing staged tableaus of heterosexual domesticity. Cooper sitting by the fireplace, Cooper playing with his daughter, Cooper projecting the exact brand of stoic patriarchal stability that the studio's shareholders demanded. This sustained public relations offensive was a calculated preemptive defense mechanism. By constantly flooding the media market with visual data confirming Cooper's adherence to heteronormativity, the studio effectively starved any residual rumors regarding Anderson Lawler of oxygen. The sheer volume of the manufactured narrative rendered the truth statistically invisible. However, the operational cost of maintaining this illusion was exorbitant, not in financial terms, but in psychological attrition. Cooper was subjected to a continuous state of performance. The architectural boundaries that normally separate an employee's professional obligations from their private existence were completely eradicated. He was a corporate asset functioning on a 24-hour operational cycle, permanently locked into a role that required the total suppression of his authentic sexual identity. As the geopolitical landscape of the mid-20th century shifted, the stakes of this corporate deception escalated dramatically. The onset of World War II and the subsequent emergence of the Cold War fundamentally weaponized the concept of American masculinity. The global conflict necessitated a cultural mobilization, wherein the ideal American male was rigidly defined as a patriotic, heterosexual warrior, a protector of the nuclear family, and an aggressive defender of democratic capitalism. The Hollywood propaganda machine, operating in direct coordination with federal initiatives, relied heavily on figures like Gary Cooper to project this martial archetype to both domestic and international audiences. In this heightened geopolitical environment, any deviation from the heterosexual mandate was no longer merely a public relations scandal. It was classified as a national security risk. This era witnessed the rise of the Lavender scare, a systemic, federally mandated purge of homosexual individuals from government and corporate employment. The prevailing psychiatric and political orthodoxy of the 1940s and 1950s officially categorized homosexuality as a severe sociopathic pathology and a definitive marker of subversion. Homosexual men were deemed inherently vulnerable to blackmail and were therefore explicitly equated with communist sympathizers and traitors to the state. For Gary Cooper, this shifting socio-political climate transformed his concealed history with Anderson Lawler from a localized studio liability into a potentially fatal, career-ending, prosecutable offense. The corporate shield provided by his Lavender marriage had to be reinforced with an ideological shield. To survive in an industry that was becoming increasingly paranoid and heavily monitored by federal agencies, Cooper had to align himself with the most aggressive, reactionary factions of the Hollywood establishment. This requirement for absolute, unquestionable conformity explains Cooper's highly publicized involvement with the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Founded in 1944, this was a fiercely anti-communist organization dedicated to purging perceived subversives from the film industry. By actively associating himself with this organization and later appearing as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, Cooper executed a masterful, albeit deeply cynical, strategy of self-preservation. His testimony before HUAC was not a demonstration of profound political conviction. It was a high-stakes corporate defensive maneuver. By publicly aligning himself with the ultimate arbiters of American moral and political orthodoxy, Cooper constructed an unassailable fortress around his public persona. The logic was brutally effective. A man who stood before the federal government to defend the moral purity of the United States could not possibly harbor a dark, subversive homosexual past. He utilized the prevailing political hysteria to insulate his own vulnerability. It was the ultimate manifestation of defensive hyperconformity. He was willing to participate in the institutional blacklisting of his colleagues to ensure that the corporate machinery never turned its investigative apparatus toward his own buried history with Anderson Lawler. While Gary Cooper was navigating these treacherous geopolitical currents on the global stage, executing the mandates of the studio system to preserve his multi-million-dollar status, Anderson Lawler's trajectory was defined by an entirely different set of structural parameters. Following the brutal studio-mandated separation in the early 1930s, Lawler did not simply vanish into a vacuum. The Hollywood ecosystem is geographically small, and the reality of his existence required constant silent negotiation. The corporate decree that severed his relationship with Cooper did not result in Lawler's physical expulsion from California, but rather his permanent relegation to the industrial periphery. The threat of the blacklist, implicitly leveraged by Paramount's fixers, remained in absolute effect. Lawler was permitted to continue operating within the entertainment sector, but only under the strict, unspoken condition of total operational invisibility regarding his past. He transitioned away from the high visibility trajectory of a leading man and embedded himself in the lower tiers of the production hierarchy. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Lawler secured employment as a stage manager, a minor theatrical producer, and an uncredited character actor in various studio productions. This peripheral existence was the precise manifestation of the era's systemic homophobia. He was kept adjacent to the industry, allowed to earn a minimal living, but structurally barred from attaining any level of influence or prominence that might render him a threat to the established order. The studio system operated on a methodology of containment rather than outright execution. It was far more efficient to keep Lawler marginalized, economically dependent, and terrified of exposure than to provoke a confrontation that might inadvertently generate press attention. The psychological reality of Lawler's position during these decades is a study in enforced compartmentalization. He was a man forced to operate within the exact industrial complex that had systematically dismantled his private life. He was required to walk onto studio lots, interact with executives, and navigate the social hierarchies of an industry that was concurrently spending millions of dollars to actively erase his historical footprint. He became a ghost within the machine, functioning in the shadows of the very apparatus that was aggressively promoting Gary Cooper as the apex of heterosexual supremacy. Lawler's survival depended on his mastery of the glass closet, a sociological phenomenon wherein an individual's homosexuality is known to the internal power structures of an industry, but is rigorously concealed from the general public. Within the closed, insular networks of Hollywood's gay subculture, Lawler's history with Cooper was a known, albeit highly guarded fact. However, crossing the threshold from the private subculture into the public domain was an act of professional suicide that Lawler could not afford to commit. He was bound by an invisible non-disclosure agreement forged through intimidation. He possessed the singular piece of intelligence capable of destroying the most valuable asset in the American film industry. Yet he was completely paralyzed by the socio-legal architecture of the era. He was a hostage to his own history. As the 1940s transitioned into the 1950s, the prolonged psychological attrition of this dual reality began to manifest somatically in Gary Cooper. No human mind can endure decades of constant, terrifying deception without the body eventually keeping the score. The sheer exhaustion of playing a relentless, high-stakes role every single hour of the day began to tear him apart from the inside out. The clinical analysis of Cooper's later years reveals a man whose physical infrastructure was slowly collapsing under the immense weight of the corporate illusion he was mandated to carry. The defensive hypersexuality that characterized his response to the Lavender marriage, the relentless, highly publicized affairs with female co-stars, did not stabilize his psyche. It exacerbated his internal fracture. These liaisons were not romantic interludes. They were exhausting, high-risk operational maneuvers required to continuously feed the studio's narrative of his aggressive heterosexuality. The effort required to constantly manage these affairs, to navigate the complexities of his corporate marriage to Veronica Balfe, and to suppress the foundational trauma of his separation from Lawler resulted in chronic debilitating stress. Biographical and medical records from the latter half of Cooper's career document a litany of stress-induced physiological ailments. He suffered from severe recurring stomach ulcers, a classic somatic manifestation of prolonged, unmitigated anxiety. His physical appearance, once the benchmark of robust, indestructible American vitality, began to age at an accelerated rate. The stoic, unyielding posture that defined his cinematic presence was increasingly compromised by chronic back pain and physical exhaustion. The alpha male was biologically deteriorating from the inside out, consumed by the toxic requirements of his own brand maintenance. During the filming of his iconic 1952 work, High Noon, the camera captured a man who looked profoundly burdened. Critics and audiences interpreted the deep lines on his face and the visible exhaustion in his eyes as a masterful performance of a weary, duty-bound sheriff facing insurmountable odds. The tragic reality, however, was that it was not entirely a performance. The exhaustion was authentic. It was the physical residue of a man who had spent over 2 decades serving a life sentence inside a corporate-mandated heterosexual prison. The studio system had successfully monetized his psychological decay, framing the somatic damage caused by their own draconian policies as the pinnacle of cinematic gravitas. Through it all, the structural separation between the two men remained absolute. The corporate purge, initiated in the early 1930s, had been flawlessly executed. Gary Cooper and Anderson Lawler were locked into their respective parallel trajectories. One imprisoned in the blinding, destructive glare of international stardom, the other confined to the silent, suffocating margins of the industrial periphery. The machine had fundamentally altered their destinies, utilizing the full spectrum of its legal, financial, and psychological power to ensure that the reality of their shared past would never disrupt the profitability of the Hollywood empire. When the Hollywood studio monopoly finally collapsed in the late 1940s, freeing actors from their draconian contracts, the emancipation arrived decades too late for Gary Cooper. The legal dismantling of Paramount Pictures did not liberate him because the studio had already achieved a far more insidious form of control. They had installed the regulatory apparatus directly into his own psyche. By the 1950s, the physical presence of studio fixers and corporate chaperones was largely unnecessary. Gary Cooper had spent over 20 years operating under the threat of total professional and social annihilation. He had survived the transatlantic psychological purge, the forced geographical separation from Anderson Lawler, and the coerced entry into a Lavender marriage with Veronica Balfe. Through decades of relentless conditioning, Cooper had thoroughly internalized the morality clause. The corporate mandate that required him to execute a flawless, continuous performance of dominant, aggressive heterosexuality was no longer an external directive. It had become his own psychological baseline. He was trapped in an invisible prison. Cooper never knew if the press, the government, or the studio were actively monitoring him, so he had to assume he was always being watched. The guard tower might have been empty, but Cooper had become his own warden. The homosexual reality he had once shared with Anderson Lawler was buried beneath so many layers of manufactured heterosexual scandal, anti-communist political posturing, and administrative domesticity that the prospect of reclaiming his authentic sexual identity was not merely professionally dangerous. It was psychologically inconceivable. The architecture of his closet was no longer built of corporate contracts. It was built of his own profound, insurmountable trauma. This internalized policing mechanism dictated the trajectory of his late career cinematic choices. As Cooper transitioned into his 50s, the physiological reality of aging presented a severe crisis for the alpha male brand. The rugged, unyielding physical perfection that had defined his early box office dominance was biologically deteriorating, exacerbated by the chronic, stress-induced somatic illnesses he suffered as a result of his psychological confinement. Yet, the imperative to validate his heterosexual supremacy remained absolute. He could not transition into benign, sexless character roles without diluting the core equity of the Gary Cooper trademark. Therefore, he was compelled to participate in increasingly strained, highly calculated cinematic exercises designed to continuously prove his virile, heterosexual dominance to the global market. In the 1957 film Love in the Afternoon, Cooper, then visibly aging and physically frail, was cast opposite Audrey Hepburn, an actress nearly 30 years his junior. To modern critical sensibilities, the casting appears grotesque and deeply unbalanced. However, viewed through the clinical lens of his corporate conditioning, this was a necessary operational maneuver. The film was a highly capitalized validation mechanism. By positioning the aging Cooper as an irresistible predatory playboy capable of seducing a woman decades younger, the film industry was artificially extending the lifespan of his manufactured heterosexual virility. It was a preemptive strike against any potential cultural perception of emasculation. He was forced to drag his failing, exhausted body across international sound stages to continuously reaffirm the foundational lie that Paramount Pictures had constructed in the early 1930s. The alpha male was not allowed to simply grow old. The studio demanded that their star conquer the screen until his heart finally gave out. Concurrently, the administrative reality of his Lavender marriage to Veronica Balfe had ossified into a permanent, highly complex institutional structure. The union, originally engineered as a public relations shield to neutralize the radioactive threat of Anderson Lawler, had accumulated decades of legal, financial, and social equity. Balfe was no longer merely a high society prop deployed for flashbulbs. She was a primary stakeholder in the Gary Cooper enterprise. The marriage was the central pillar of his public respectability, heavily intertwined with his financial holdings, his social standing among the conservative East Coast elite, and his carefully curated image as a bastion of traditional American values. The absolute rigidity of this corporate marital structure was brutally demonstrated during Cooper's highly publicized, extended extramarital affair with actress Patricia Neal in the late 1940s and early 1950s. While Cooper's chronic infidelities had long served as a convenient smokescreen, a frantic performance to constantly prove his masculinity to a scrutinizing public, the intense situation with Patricia Neal threatened to permanently shatter the acceptable parameters of his corporate arrangement. Cooper, suffering from profound psychological exhaustion and seeking a permanent escape from the suffocating administrative reality of his life with Balfe, signaled an intention to seek a legal divorce. The response from the institutional forces surrounding him was immediate, overwhelming, and structurally devastating. A divorce was not merely a personal failure, it was a catastrophic brand dilution. If Gary Cooper dismantled the marriage that had served as his primary claim to moral orthodoxy for 2 decades, he risked exposing the entire underlying architecture of his deception. The intervention was swift. The remnants of the studio system's public relations apparatus mobilized to suppress the scandal. More critically, the ecclesiastical power of the Roman Catholic Church, of which Balfe was a devout, high-profile member, was leveraged against him. Cooper was subjected to intense, coordinated psychological pressure from conservative social circles, industry executives, and religious authorities. They systematically terrorized Patricia Neal, effectively destroying her standing in Hollywood and forcing her to terminate the pregnancy she conceived with Cooper. The suppression of the Patricia Neal affair was a violent, institutional course correction. It proved that Cooper possessed absolutely no lateral mobility. The system would tolerate and even quietly encourage his relentless heterosexual infidelities, as they served to reinforce his straight masculine image. But the system would not permit him to dismantle the foundational Lavender marriage. He was violently forced back into the domestic jurisdiction of Veronica Balfe. The brief illusion that he might be able to alter the terms of his life sentence was extinguished. He was reminded with chilling clarity that the contract he had entered into in 1933 to erase Anderson Lawler was irrevocable. He was locked inside the administrative prison of his own respectability, and the keys had been thrown away by the very demographic he entertained. While Gary Cooper was enduring this high-profile, agonizingly visible process of institutional containment, Anderson Lawler's reality was defined by an escalating localized terror. If the 1930s had demanded Lawler's operational invisibility to satisfy the corporate mandates of Paramount Pictures, the 1950s demanded his absolute undetectable silence to survive the geopolitical and municipal realities of Los Angeles. The homophobia of the era was no longer merely a corporate policy designed to protect box office receipts. It had been codified into aggressive, militarized law enforcement doctrine. During the 1950s, the Los Angeles Police Department, under the authoritarian command of Chief William H. Parker, operated as a paramilitary organization dedicated to the eradication of deviant subcultures. The LAPD vice squads executed a relentless, systematic campaign of municipal suppression against the city's underground homosexual community. Gay bars were routinely raided, subjected to aggressive surveillance and shut down. Undercover officers utilized entrapment tactics to arrest homosexual men in public parks, bathhouses, and private residences. An arrest on a morals charge during this era was a socio-legal death sentence. It resulted in immediate public exposure, total professional termination, mandatory registration as a sex offender, and frequently severe physical violence at the hands of law enforcement. For Anderson Lawler, the stakes of maintaining his glass closet had escalated from the threat of corporate blacklisting to the threat of physical incarceration and absolute social ruin. He was a man aging in the shadows of an industry that prized youth, carrying a secret that was classified by the municipal government as a felony. He could not participate in the burgeoning, albeit heavily persecuted, homophile movements of the early 1950s, such as the Mattachine Society. Any association with organized homosexual networks exponentially increased his risk of exposure. He was forced into a state of hypervigilance, navigating the geography of Los Angeles as if it were a hostile, occupied territory. Lawler's psychological isolation during this decade was absolute. He was the ultimate keeper of a radioactive secret. He possessed the historical data capable of destroying Gary Cooper, a man who was now deeply entrenched in the anti-communist, hyper-conservative establishment of the Cold War era. The paranoia must have been suffocating. Lawler had to live with the constant ambient terror that a single misstep, a single raid on a discreet Hollywood gathering, or a single coerced confession from a member of the underground community could inadvertently expose his past. If the LAPD Vice Squad ever connected Lawler to Cooper, the resulting explosion would not only annihilate Lawler's fragile peripheral existence, but would invite the full retaliatory wrath of Cooper's powerful right-wing institutional allies. Therefore, Lawler's silence was no longer merely a condition of his employment. It was a fundamental requirement for his physical and legal survival. He was structurally barred from acknowledging his own past. He could not write memoirs, he could not grant interviews to the nascent underground press, and he could not seek historical validation for the years he had spent as the domestic partner of the most famous man in America. He had to actively participate in his own historical erasure. The studio system had successfully severed his relationship in the 1930s, but the militarized homophobia of the 1950s ensured that the grave they had dug for his identity remained permanently sealed. The parallel trajectories of Gary Cooper and Anderson Lawler in the twilight of the 1950s provide a devastating clinical portrait of systemic oppression. They were two men fundamentally broken by the same industrial machinery, yet experiencing their destruction from opposite ends of the Hollywood spectrum. Cooper was deteriorating in the blinding light of international fame. His somatic infrastructure collapsing under the weight of a multi-decade forced heterosexual performance, trapped within a corporate marriage from which there was no legal or social exit. Lawler was deteriorating in the absolute, terrifying darkness of the municipal underground. His identity criminalized by the state, forced to swallow his own history to avoid incarceration and total ruin. They were bound together by a shared trauma that neither was legally or socially permitted to articulate. The Hollywood ecosystem had executed a perfect, bloodless campaign of psychological warfare. The system had prioritized the uninterrupted generation of capital and the maintenance of a manufactured cultural ideal over the fundamental human rights of its employees. As the decade drew to a close and the physiological realities of aging and illness began to aggressively assert themselves upon both men, the true, inescapable architecture of their respective prisons became undeniably clear. There would be no late-stage emancipation, no historical correction, and no public reconciliation. The contracts had been signed, the narratives had been cemented, and the alpha male illusion had to be maintained unto death. By the late 1950s, the physical reality of aging and severe illness began to dismantle the Gary Cooper alpha male facade. As his health visibly failed after decades of intense public scrutiny, the Paramount apparatus faced a biological crisis they could not control with standard public relations. Instead of allowing their star to step away, the studio and compliant press reframed his visible exhaustion and subsequent battle with prostate cancer as the ultimate manifestation of masculine stoicism. The deep lines on his face were marketed as the physical evidence of a weathered patriarch. This medicalization of his public persona effectively insulated his final years from deep historical interrogation, making it socially prohibitive for journalists to question the foundational narrative of a revered, suffering, elder statesman. Concurrently, the legal and financial architecture surrounding Cooper had ossified into an impenetrable estate. His marriage to Veronica Balfe, initially a strategic PR maneuver, was now the central pillar of a massive familial trust. This financial reality structurally guaranteed his silence. To acknowledge any prior cohabitation with Anderson Lawler would not merely damage his legacy, it risked the socio-legal foundation of his estate and the financial security of his dependents. The corporate system ensured that protecting the established narrative was the only viable method to protect his family. While Cooper was managed through his highly capitalized decline, surrounded by medical specialists and global adulation, Anderson Lawler faced his biological termination in total systemic obscurity. Lawler's trajectory through the late 1950s demonstrates the absolute efficiency of the era's blacklist mechanisms. Operating entirely outside the protective financial infrastructure of the Hollywood elite, he aged in a municipal environment that actively criminalized his sexual identity. He possessed no robust corporate estate and no public relations apparatus. The stark divergence of their realities became absolute in the spring of 1959. On April 6th, Anderson Lawler died. The event did not register in the industry trades. There were no retrospective articles or studio-mandated periods of mourning. The system that had severed his public association with Cooper 30 years prior didn't need to suppress the news of his passing because he had already been rendered industrially invisible. Furthermore, the institutional parameters governing Cooper's public existence legally and practically precluded any demonstration of grief. Acknowledging the passing of a marginalized actor from his distant past would have triggered the exact investigative scrutiny he had spent his life avoiding. Following Lawler's death, Cooper's own timeline accelerated toward its conclave, Ujion. His prostate cancer aggressively metastasized. Yet the corporate parameters held absolute. His final profound cinematic act was a highly orchestrated proxy event at the 33rd Academy Awards in April 1961. Too physically ravaged to attend, Cooper was awarded an honorary Oscar, accepted on his behalf by his close friend James Stewart. Stewart's emotional, nationally televised acceptance speech provided the American public with a sanctioned mourning for the quintessential heterosexual hero. The broadcast completely dominated the cultural bandwidth, cementing the legacy before Cooper had even passed. Gary Cooper died on May 13, 1961, exactly 6 days after his 60th birthday. The chronological proximity of their deaths provided a silent closure to one of Hollywood's most heavily managed situations. With the expiration of both men, the threat of primary source historical exposure was neutralized. The Hollywood system buried the complexities of Cooper's early life and his time with Lawler beneath industry accolades and Vatican-sanctioned respectability, prioritizing the preservation of a highly profitable cinematic icon over the unredacted historical record.